blaspheming Moses and talking about destroying the temple.
Yes, right. Yeah, talking about getting rid of the temple, which was something that Jesus was tried on, right? Remember at his trial, because he had said, in 3 days destroy this temple and I will rebuild it again. He was talking about the temple of his body, but they're saying, oh, he's going to get rid of the temple. So they're accusing Stephen of undermining the temple. And the second thing was trying to destroy the religion of Moses, the things that Moses had taught. So Stephen launches into this long chapter, this big, long history of Israel. When I would read it at first, I couldn't figure out where's he going with this. Why is he reviewing all of this stuff? Is he trying to postpone his stoning? As long as he's like filibustering or something. But now you can see it clearly. So these are the two things that I want us to highlight as we go through it. So we're not going to talk about everything in this chapter, but we're going to just go through now and highlight these two things. He's being accused of wanting to get rid of the temple. And so in his history of Israel, one of the things that he calls attention to again and again is God meeting with his people, not in the temple, someplace besides the temple. He's laying out that background. And the other thing that he was accused of is trying to destroy the teachings of Moses. So the second thing that his history of Israel is going to show is how it's not Stephen, it's the Israelites who have fought against God and against Moses again and again and again. So they're just in part of a long line of people who have resisted what the Lord has done. So I think we finished last week at verse 8. Let's pick up then at verse 9. Chapter 7, verse 9. And the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt. But, look at that, God was with him. So God was with Joseph. Where was God with Joseph? In Egypt, right. Rescued him from his afflictions. He gained favor and wisdom. Pharaoh made him a ruler. Then the famine came. There was no food. Jacob, Joseph's father, heard that there was grain in Egypt, so he sent our fathers. That would be, who are the fathers there? That would be Joseph's brothers, right? Jacob's other sons. Remember that story, how they came down to Egypt? And they got sent on the first visit. This is worth calling attention to. In verse 12, they went on the first visit, but it wasn't until the second visit that Joseph made himself known to his brothers. Remember that?
Now when did Joseph stick the silver chalice and stuff in the wheat bags to get them back to Egypt?
Yeah, was that so? I think when they came the first time, didn't he say you have to bring? Now I'm trying to remember the story. This sounds bad to tape. You have to bring your youngest brother Benjamin, because what was it?
You have to bring Benjamin.
Yeah, you have to bring Benjamin, because Benjamin and Joseph were full brothers. They had the same mothers. So he didn't see Benjamin growing up. He didn't know Benjamin, so he was eager to see Benjamin. So you got to bring Benjamin, and then it's when they came the second time that he hid the silver in Benjamin's sack.
Yeah.
And so you could see that he was testing them, right? Are the brothers going to go, oh yeah, Benjamin, he's the black sheep of the family.
Well,
He's the garbage, right? Just arrest him. Because were they jealous of him because he was also Rachel's daughter? Son. Or had they accepted him as a full brother? And of course, when the silver cup was discovered, what did the brothers do? Yeah, don't keep Benjamin here. Take us rather. And then Joseph could see that they had accepted him, and he was a full brother. And it was some point after that then that he revealed himself Yeah, he went by himself and cried. He had to leave the room, go somewhere and cry. Isn't that something? Sometimes some tears are a good thing. Go in another room and cry a little bit. And that's when he reveals himself to the other brothers. But what I want to call attention to here in Stephen's speech is there's like the first visit, and then there's the second visit. So you almost wonder if underlying that is this larger message to the people of Israel. You rejected Moses, and you rejected God's coming to you at first, and now God has come to you again a second time, but in the person of his son, Christ. Are you going to reject him the second time? It's almost like an undertone to all of this. Okay, verse 14, Joseph sent and summoned Jacob and his father and all his kindred. So now they go get the father, and the whole family comes down to Egypt. And verse 15, so Jacob went down to Egypt. And so where is Jacob the patriarch and all of his sons? At the temple? There was no temple then. They're in Egypt. Right? And then, verse 16, they're carried back to Shechem and laid in the tomb that Abraham had bought for a sum of silver from the sons of Hamor. Mike made a good observation, I think, last week. I don't think the Genesis account, it mentions bringing back the bones of Jacob. I don't know that it says anything about bringing back the bones of Joseph's other brothers. I could be wrong. I should have checked it. But we know from this story then that was what happened. All their bones were brought back and buried back in the promised land. Okay, verse 17. Now the time of the promise drew near. The people are increasing. They're multiplying in Egypt. There arises a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. He deals shrewdly. That's quite a word, right? Shrewdly. And he forced our fathers to expose their infants. That was how today would have aborted them, right? That was their way of killing babies. But when Moses is born, he's beautiful in God's sight. They hide him for 3 months in his father's house. Now you can't hide him anymore. If you've ever had a 3-month-old, you know why that is. And so when he's exposed, Pharaoh's daughter adopts him. Remember, she finds him in the Nile, right? Draws him out. That's where he gets his name. Verse 22, and he's instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He's mighty. Verse 23, then when he's 40 years old, he goes to visit. He discovers that he's an Israelite, and he sees one of his own people being wronged by an Egyptian, and so he strikes down the Egyptian. And look at verse 25. He supposed that his brothers would understand that God was giving them salvation by his hand, but they did not understand. Oh, so there's that second theme for us, right? Why had Moses come? To bring them salvation, and they didn't understand. So all these little phrases are carefully placed in there to build up that they were rejecting Moses. So that's the next day when he sees 2 other Israelites quarreling. He says, "Why are you quarreling?" And one of them says, verse 27, "Who made you a ruler and a judge over us?" So there again in the story of Moses. Why had God sent Moses? To be the deliverer, right? The one who would help them and rescue them. But what's the response here in the mouths of this one of his own people? Who made you the ruler and judge over it? So there's more rejection of Moses. Do you see that theme? You want to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian? Now Moses realizes that everybody knows about this, so he has to escape. So that's when he goes to Midian. He becomes the father of 2 sons. And now verse 40. When 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in a flame of fire in a bush. So where did God speak to Moses in the burning bush? At the temple? No. Mount Sinai, right. So once again, outside the temple, somewhere else is where God is meeting his people. God speaks to Moses. Moses trembles and dares not to look. Verse 33. This is kind of a concatenation here of different verses. So there's several verses in Exodus chapter 3 that are pieced together to make this quote. Take off the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Because, of course, he's standing in the holy temple.
No.
Oh, no. Right. Where's the holy ground? Somewhere else. Yeah. I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their groaning, and I will come down to deliver them. So the Lord is coming to rescue them. But look at verse 35. This Moses, whom they rejected, saying, who made you a ruler and a judge? So it's reiterating what I just pointed out, that in that who made you a ruler and a judge counts in the sight of God as rejection of Moses. Now God appears to him, or the angel appears to him in the bush. Verse 36, this man led them out, performing wonders and signs in Egypt. So now, what were the wonders and the signs that Moses did? Part of the Red Sea, even before that.
Snake on a stick.
Yeah, turning the staff into the snake.
Plagues.
Fire fall from the sky, or hail, turn fire.
Yeah, the 10 plagues, all the 10 plagues. And then, what's that? Striking the rock and having the water come out. And then remember sticking his hand in and it comes out leprous, and then puts it in again and it comes out
Clean.
clean. Yeah, so God gave Moses the ability to do these miraculous signs to prove to the people that God was speaking through him. Now, they rejected that first coming to them of God in the person of Moses. Now a second time God has come to them in the person of Christ. And what did Christ do?
Signs and wonders.
Signs and wonders. And by the way, now this emissary of Christ, the one who's speaking, Stephen, in chapter 6, do you remember what did he do? He could do signs and wonders. That's kind of remarkable. In other words, signs and wonders were not restricted to the apostles. God is using Stephen here to do signs and wonders. But it's a way of confirming to them that God has come to you again. And what's their response going to be? Is it going to be like the first time when Moses did it? Verse 37. Now this is the Moses who said to the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers. I don't think we will look it up, but we've looked it up in other Bible studies before. I know from Deuteronomy chapter 18, you remember? What is the sign of a true prophet in the Old Testament from God? Whatever they say has to come true. If it doesn't, then they're not from God. They were supposed to be stoned. And there's the promise there that God was going to always send a prophet to his people, including a prophet like me. In other words, a prophet of that same great stature. So just rattle off the names of some prophets in the history of Israel. Just rattle a bunch off. Malachi, Isaiah, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah,
Jonah, Micah, Nahum,
Nathan, yeah, all the minor prophets, Jeremiah, Samuel, he always, but Elijah. But there's one of all the prophets in the Old Testament that stands head and shoulders above the rest. Who is the greatest one of them all?
Isaiah.
Moses. And so it's the promise that God's going to give. There's going to be one prophet who, like Moses, is going to be head and shoulders above them all. That, by the way, next week I won't be here, but it's Transfiguration. That's part of the whole thing behind Transfiguration, right? You've got Moses, And then who was the prophet in the Old Testament that was most like Moses? Elijah. And then you've got Jesus. Those three on the Mount of Transfiguration. So the fulfillment of Deuteronomy 18, who is the prophet that God sends like Moses, the one that's just well high above all the rest? It's Jesus. So when he says here in verse 37, this quote that God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brothers, he's pointing them toward Jesus, right? Verse 38, this is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness with the angel who spoke to him at Mount Sinai and with our fathers. And he received living oracles to give to us. So where were they when they received these living oracles from God? Were they in the temple? No. Where were they? In the wilderness. And it's a very interesting word there to note too. They were in the congregation in the wilderness. That is, you don't see that word much in the Old Testament. That's really a New Testament word. Because what is the congregation? We have a congregation here, Hope Evangelical Lutheran Church, a congregation at Hope. What is it? It's the gathering, it's the assembly, it's the collection of believers. So when there's a congregation in the wilderness to whom God speaks, and he's using that kind of New Testament word, doesn't that have some foreshadowing of the fact that in our covenant now, in our time, God has also called together a congregation to which he gives his living oracle. So you see, I mean, the language here, he's using these allusions and these little phrases, and he's dropping these words, but all with an eye toward looking at how these things that happen in the Old Testament point toward what we experience in the New Testament, what they were experienced then in the first generation of Christianity.
Pastor, what's a living oracle?
A living oracle is the oracles are the words, the messages
okay.
from God. So the living oracles would be like the speaking of the prophets, giving them God's words.
Okay.
Yeah. Look at verse 39. So God is speaking to the congregation through Moses in the wilderness. In verse 39, our fathers, oh, look at that, refused to obey him. So there they are again, rejecting him. They thrust him aside. In their hearts they turned to Egypt, saying to Aaron. So now we're fast forwarding to Mount Sinai. And remember when Moses went up on Mount Sinai to get the 10 Commandments and to get all the word of the Lord, and all the people were told, don't touch the mountain or you're going to die. And they're waiting for Moses, and they're waiting and they're waiting. And what do they decide to do? Yeah, they make the golden calves and they have a giant orgy down there. That's what they did. So they said to Aaron, make for us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses who led us out from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. And they made a calf in those days, and they offered a sacrifice to the idol, and were rejoicing in the works of their hands. So what do we see again from God's people? Rejection of Moses. Doing the opposite of what Moses commanded, creating an idol with their hands and worshiping the idol. Now, this is very interesting. Verse 42. But God turned away and, see that, gave them over to worship the host of heaven, as it is written in the book of the prophets. So now there's going to be a quote from the prophet Amos. And the prophet Amos there is making a reference to worshiping the host of heaven. I've got a whole bunch, we just won't take the time. I've got a whole bunch of Bible verses we could look up talking about the host of heaven. When they're worshiping the host of heaven, what is it that they're worshiping? Gods that are kind of named after the stars. Like verse 43 here, and the star of your God, Reverend, that would be Saturn, the planet Saturn. And when did that worship really kick in the history of Israel? When did they start to do that? If we could look up the Bible verses that I had for you, you would see it, but I'm just going to tell you, okay? That really kicked in close to the time of the Assyrian exile. So, 700 years after the golden calf at Mount Sinai. So that's why I wanted to call attention to this. Verse 42 at the beginning where it says, God turned away and gave them over to worship the host of heaven. In other words, 700 years later, when they were worshiping these planet gods, or gods that kind of live in the stars, that sort of thing, why was it? It was part of their punishment that God had given them way back when they worshiped the golden calf at Mount Sinai. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Think about that for the implications of our society today. I've told you before, I'm not a prophet, but I have a prophet's questioning mind. I'm always wanting to know, what is God doing in our world? And think about in Romans where it talks about the homosexuals. Why are they homosexuals? Because they were misgendered, or because, they have, God created them differently and that sort of thing. God says it's because he gave them over. Same kind of language. In other words, when they sinned, he gave up on them in such a way that they fell into vile practices. And so here he's given up on Israel in a sense, so that they fall into these vile practices of the Assyrians, worshiping these star gods. And that's part of the God's judgment. So you have to wonder, I just wonder, when I look at our country today, how our country in just a few decades has turned from pro-Judeo-Christian values to anti-Judeo-Christian values. Anything Judeo-Christian in our culture, society is under attack. Terribly. It has happened so fast. Why is that? Is it because people just change their minds, or is there something where God has given our country over? That's part of our judgment. That's part of what God has said. All right, you want to sin? Go off and sin like crazy. Just let it be wild and crazy. Go ahead, and you'll reap the results of it. I just wondered that.
Yes, Paul says, and God gave them over to a reprobate mind.
Reprobate mind.
And I always looked at it that God says, okay, he said, fine, you want to live that way? Go ahead.
That's right.
Then let me know how that works out for you.
Yeah. And we got to be clear. Because some of you here, I'm sure, you have probably nieces or nephews or somebody that's caught it. And this is not, we're not talking about an individual person here. I guess it could be, but that's not the focus. The focus is on the society. It's on the culture. It's on what God is doing kind of to the group.
Do you think it's from the New Age churches that have sprung up in the last 20 years, like creating an atmosphere of love, and not bringing in the gospel, or bringing the gospel but not the sin?
I ask myself, it's a good question, Kim, and I ask myself, what might be the triggers that would cause God to have said, okay, go that way then? And that is a possibility, but I don't know. I don't know. Okay, verse 44. Our fathers had the tent of witness in the wilderness. So, where was the tent of witness? In the temple? No, it's in the wilderness. And it remains then, remember, till the days of David. You remember the story of David? David had a big palace, and the tabernacle was outside, and he said, I'm gonna build a big temple. And he goes to the prophet Nathan, and Nathan goes, that's a great idea, let's build a big temple. And that night God says to Nathan, no, tell him no. Yeah. He's not going to build it, his son's going to build it. So verse 47, it's Solomon then who builds a house for him. So now we finally get up to the point where there is a temple. But look at this most interesting passage that he mentions in verse 48. Yet the Most High does not dwell in houses made by hands. Well, where does he get that idea? I thought that's where God lives, in the temple. Solomon himself said that when he dedicated the temple. Remember? He thanked God and he praised God that we now have this place where our prayers could go up to the Lord. And then he says, but how can this house contain you? The heavens and the earth can't contain you. And so Stephen here is making an Old Testament quote in verses 49 and 50 from Isaiah 66, verse 1. And look at that passage. Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build for me, says the Lord, or what is the place of my rest? Did not my hand make all these things? In other words, it's in the scriptures itself that the temple is not the end all of everything, right? It's not God's not in the temple. He's bigger than the temple. So the thing that they're accusing Stephen of, you see how in his whole recitation here, he's called attention that it's not about the temple being the biggest and most important thing. And then we get to verse 51. And as I said last week, if Stephen's goal was not to get stoned, he really messed up here. Clearly, that was not his goal. And so now he applies it. He's been showing them that the temple is not the main thing, how it's their forefathers who have rejected the prophets and rejected Moses over and over again, and now he pings right on them. And this is Old Testament language, by the way. We could look up verses where he uses these words. You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears. In other words, outwardly they're circumcised, but their hearts are not. And you always resist the Holy Spirit. That's where we get our doctrine as Lutherans. I'm out of time. As Lutherans, we say, can you make a choice to be a Christian and follow Jesus? No, God makes you a Christian. He comes to you in word and sacrament and creates faith in your heart. Well, what about those then who are not Christian? Is it because God did not choose them? Some of the Reformed would say that, but Lutherans would never say that. We say it's their fault. They resisted, right? So if you're a Christian, God gets the praise. If you go to hell, it's your fault. That's what it is. As your fathers did, so do you. Which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who announced beforehand the coming of the righteous one. So now he brings it back to Jesus, right? Whom you have now betrayed and murdered. So the end result of their always resisting God is that they ended up resisting the Son of God, Jesus. And they crucified him on the cross. Well, they get so mad at him, what do? They stone him. And while he's being stoned, he's full of the Holy Spirit. He has a vision of Jesus. There's more I could talk about here. There's a lot of great stuff. But I think the point is that's vindication of what he has said. That's the proof that the things Stephen has said were being led by the Lord. God was directing him to say this. He wasn't just talking out of the side of his head, right? And so he becomes the first martyr, the first one to die for his faith. Since then, we have had many. And as he dies, like Jesus did on the cross, when Jesus said, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. What does Stephen say? Lord, do not hold this sin against them. So you look at all how his vision of Jesus has changed him. And here's the key thing for us to remember. As old Germans now, 2,000 years later, remember that Stephen is a Hellenistic Jew. And so we're already starting to see the shift away from the temple and the system of sacrifices in Judaism being the center of everything. That is now shifting to where God is moving his focus upon the rest of the world. And that's going to be all of us. So a few decades later, when the temple is destroyed, wow, again, I talk about God acting in history. Do you think that was an accident? No. As God's work there in the temple now passes outwardly, the temple is done away with. There are no temple sacrifices anymore. God now speaks to you through word and sacrament. Even though we're not Jews, even though we don't sacrifice the goats and the sheep. So this is all part of God's plan for how he's going to get us. I think Nadine said last week, our ancestors were probably in caves in Germany at this time. But God already knew you would be here, and he had a plan for bringing you in. All right, I'm sorry I went a couple minutes over. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. God bless.